What Jesus revealed about fasting to a young woman after her death will shock you. Imagine this. A young woman, full of life, suddenly finds herself on the brink of death. That morning, her day had started like any other. She brewed her favorite coffee, always 2 sugars, no cream, and sat by the window as sunlight streamed through the curtains. Her dog, a golden retriever named Max, rested at her feet, wagging his tail as she hummed to herself. Later, she met up with friends at a bustling cafe where the chatter of people and clinking of cups created a comforting backdrop. They laughed until their stomachs hurt, swapping stories and teasing her about how she always seemed to be late for everything. "I'll be on time tomorrow, I swear," she had joked, completely unaware of how precious that promise would soon become. And then, the unthinkable happens. Her breathing slowed, each gasp more strained than the last. Her mother leaned in close, tears streaming down her face. "Stay with us, baby," she pleaded, her voice breaking. Then, without warning, the room went still. The heart monitor let out a long, piercing tone. The nurse froze mid-step. The doctor's hands hovered, motionless, and the only sound was the desperate sob of her younger brother, who fell to his knees in the corner of the room. The light in her eyes dimmed, and the world seemed to shatter in that moment. But that's not the end of her story. It's only the beginning. It started like any other day. She woke up, went about her routine, completely unaware of what was about to happen. There was no warning, no slow decline. It hit like lightning, an unexplained medical emergency that sent her rushing to the hospital. It started with a dull ache in her chest, one she thought was nothing more than stress. "I'm fine," she assured her sister on the phone, brushing it off. But as the hours passed, the ache spread, sharp and unrelenting, making it hard to breathe. Her hands shook as she dialed her mother. "Something's wrong," she whispered. By the time they reached the hospital, her skin was pale, her breathing shallow. The doctors spoke in hushed tones, running test after test, but no one could explain why her condition was spiraling so fast. Her mother clutched her hand tightly, whispering prayers as her father paced the hallway, trying to stay strong for the family. Doctors worked tirelessly, but the answers weren't coming fast enough. Her loved ones stood helpless, watching as the life seemed to drain from her before their eyes. And then, in a single, gut-wrenching moment, the machines went still. The monitors flatlined. She was gone. What happened next is something she would struggle to put into words. One moment, she felt the pain, the chaos, the noise of the hospital around her. The next, there was silence. She later described it as a feeling of detachment, like stepping out of a crowded room into complete stillness. She wasn't afraid. In fact, she felt weightless, peaceful. At first, she thought she was dreaming. The pain that had racked her body was suddenly gone, replaced by a strange, weightless sensation. She opened her eyes, or at least she thought she did, and looked down. What she saw stopped her cold. There she was, lying on the hospital bed, her face pale, her body still. Doctors moved around her frantically, their faces etched with urgency. She wanted to reach out to them, to tell them she was right there, but when she tried, her hand passed through the railing of the bed like mist. She wasn't afraid. Instead, she felt a calmness she couldn't explain, like the tension she'd carried her whole life had finally lifted. She described looking down and seeing her own body on the hospital bed, surrounded by doctors and nurses frantically trying to bring her back. Her family was there too, holding hands, praying, crying. It was surreal, like watching a movie play out in front of her. But what struck her most was how calm she felt. She wasn't panicked or desperate. She felt free. And then she noticed it, a light in the distance. At first it was faint, like a small flicker in the darkness, but it grew brighter and brighter, pulling her toward it. She couldn't resist it, even if she wanted to. It wasn't just light. It was warmth, comfort, and something she couldn't quite explain. It felt alive. As she moved toward it, everything else began to fade away. The hospital, her body, even her thoughts about what was happening. All that mattered was the light. It was magnetic, drawing her closer with every step. And then, just as she reached it, the light seemed to open up, revealing something that took her breath away. What she saw and what she experienced would change her life forever. It wasn't just a fleeting moment or a hazy dream. It felt more real than anything she had ever known. She described it as stepping into another world, one that was vibrant, beautiful, and overwhelming in its intensity. But this wasn't a dream or a fantasy. She knew without a doubt she was somewhere extraordinary. She felt the presence of something or someone there with her. It was hard to describe, but she knew she wasn't alone. It felt like being welcomed, as if she had been expected. The warmth, the peace, the sheer magnitude of it all. It was unlike anything she had ever experienced. And then, just as she began to feel like she might stay in this place forever, something changed. A voice, or maybe it was a feeling, told her it wasn't her time. She couldn't stay. She had to go back. She didn't want to. She felt so at peace, so at home in this strange, beautiful place. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling, "don't send me back." She clung to the warmth, to the peace, to the presence of the figure before her. For the first time in her life, she felt truly whole, and the thought of leaving it behind was unbearable. Tears streamed down her face as she pleaded, "I can't. I'm not strong enough to go back." The figure placed a hand on her shoulder, and though his expression didn't change, she felt the weight of his love in that single touch. "You are enough," he said, his voice steady, unshakable. And with those words, the light around her began to fade, and she felt herself being pulled back into the noise, the weight, the chaos of the world she had left behind. But before she could argue or resist, everything shifted again. The light faded, the warmth began to slip away, and suddenly she was back in her body, gasping for air, alive. Her family cheered. The doctors called it a miracle. But she couldn't stop thinking about what she had seen, what she had felt. It wasn't just the near-death experience that shook her. It was the overwhelming sense that she had been given a second chance and that her story was meant to be told. What happened to her after that moment? How did she make sense of it all? And what did she learn from her journey to the brink of death and back? Stay tuned, because this is just the beginning of her incredible story. As she moved closer to the light, everything else began to fade. The sounds, the images of the hospital, even the sense of time itself. It was like stepping out of a storm into perfect calm. The closer she got, the brighter and more alive the light seemed to become. It wasn't harsh or blinding. Instead, it felt warm, like a soft sunrise, but with an intensity that seemed to go beyond what her senses could fully process. And then, as she stepped into the light, she realized it wasn't just light at all. It was a presence, a force so overwhelming that it seemed to wrap around her, filling every part of her being with an indescribable peace. For the first time in her life, she felt completely whole, as if every question, every fear, every worry she had ever carried was stripped away in an instant. She couldn't say how she knew, but she felt it deep within her. She was in the presence of something greater than herself, something infinite and eternal. As she stood there, she began to notice things around her. The light wasn't empty. It was alive, filled with movement and warmth. She later described it as if the air itself had a heartbeat, pulsing with a rhythm that resonated deep in her chest. And then she saw him. She sensed him before she saw him, an undeniable presence that made her heart race, not with fear, but with a feeling she could only describe as awe. When the figure stepped forward, her breath caught in her chest. His eyes were unlike anything she had ever seen, deep pools of kindness and understanding that seemed to look straight through her, seeing not just who she was, but every moment that had shaped her. She wanted to speak, to ask 1,000 questions, but words seemed unnecessary. In his presence, she felt completely known, completely accepted. It was as if she had been waiting her whole life for this moment, and now that it was here, she never wanted it to end. At first, it was just a figure in the distance, but as she moved closer, she realized it was someone standing in the center of the light. He didn't speak, not at first, but she knew, this was someone who knew her completely, someone who had seen every moment of her life and still welcomed her with open arms. The presence radiated love, a love so profound that it brought tears to her eyes. She didn't feel judged or unworthy. She felt accepted, as if everything she had ever done, every mistake, every regret, was already known and forgiven. She wanted to fall to her knees, to stay in that moment forever, but the figure stepped forward and spoke. "Your journey isn't over." The voice wasn't loud or commanding. It was gentle, calm, but filled with an authority that made it impossible to question. She wanted to stay, to ask questions, to understand what was happening, but the figure raised a hand, and suddenly the scene around her shifted. In an instant, she wasn't in the light anymore. She was somewhere else entirely, somewhere vibrant and beautiful. She saw fields that stretched endlessly, filled with colors more vivid than anything she had ever seen on Earth. The air was crisp and fresh, filled with a sense of life and vitality that seemed to hum all around her. She felt a pull to explore, to lose herself in this incredible place. But the figure beside her spoke again. "There's something you need to see." And with those words, the vision changed. Suddenly, she was no longer in the peaceful, vibrant fields. Instead, she was looking at a scene of Earth, her life, her world. But it wasn't just her life. It was life as a whole. She saw people struggling, caught in the chaos of their daily routines. She saw pain and heartbreak, people weighed down by burdens they couldn't seem to escape. It was overwhelming, almost too much to take in, but the figure beside her placed a hand on her shoulder, and she felt calm again. "This is why fasting matters," he said. At first, she didn't understand. Fasting, how could that possibly connect to what she was seeing? But as the vision unfolded, it became clear. She saw people who were lost, disconnected from the things that truly mattered. She saw how the noise of the world, its distractions, its temptations, drowned out the still, small voice inside them. Fasting wasn't about deprivation, the figure explained. It was about making space to reconnect, to hear, to feel what had been there all along. As he spoke, she saw images of people who had found clarity through fasting, people who had broken free from chains they didn't even realize were holding them. She saw how it wasn't just about food, it was about discipline, about taking control of the things that controlled you. And in doing so, it allowed something far greater to take their place. "It's not about what you give up," he said. "It's about what you make room for." Those words echoed in her mind as the vision faded, leaving her standing once again in the presence of the figure. She wanted to ask more, to understand everything he was showing her, but she could sense that her time there was coming to an end. "There's more for you to do," he said, his voice soft but firm. "You've been given a glimpse, but it's not your time to stay." She wanted to argue, to beg to remain in that place of peace and clarity, but before she could say a word, the light began to dim. She felt herself being pulled backward, away from the figure, away from the warmth and the calm. The last thing she heard was his voice, as steady as ever, saying, "Share what you've seen. Help others find their way." And just like that, she was back. back in her body, gasping for air, surrounded by the familiar sounds of the hospital. Her family was there, tears streaming down their faces as they realized she was alive. The doctors were stunned, calling it a miracle. But she couldn't focus on any of that. Her mind was racing with everything she had just experienced, everything she had seen and heard. She knew her life could never be the same again. She had been given a second chance, and with it, a mission to share the message she had been given. What happened to her wasn't just an extraordinary experience. It was a wake-up call, not just for her, but for everyone who would one day hear her story. She found herself back in that radiant light, standing in awe of everything she had just seen. The figure was still there, waiting patiently, as if time didn't exist in this place. She wanted to ask a million questions about the visions, about fasting, about the people she had seen struggling, and the ones who had found freedom. But before she could speak, the figure raised his hand, and once again, everything around her began to change. This time, she wasn't just seeing the world, she was feeling it. She was shown glimpses of humanity, not just as an outsider, but as if she were stepping into the hearts of the people she saw. She felt their pain, their fear, their longing for something more. It was overwhelming, like being hit with wave after wave of raw emotion. She saw a mother praying desperately for her sick child, her heart heavy with fear but clinging to hope. She felt the crushing loneliness of an elderly man sitting in an empty home, wondering if anyone even remembered he was alive. She experienced the silent despair of someone caught in addiction, their soul crying out for freedom while their body betrayed them. It was almost too much to bear. She turned to the figure, tears streaming down her face, and said, "Why are you showing me this? What can I do about all of this pain?" The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured again, and the vision shifted. This time she saw something else, something extraordinary. She saw people stepping away from the noise of their lives, setting aside the distractions and chaos that had consumed them. She saw them sitting in stillness, fasting, and praying. At first, they looked uncertain, almost hesitant, as if they weren't sure what they were doing. But then something began to change. She saw their faces soften, their eyes brighten. She felt the weight lifting from their shoulders as they let go of the things that had held them down. And in that quiet space they had created, something new began to grow. A connection, a sense of peace, a spark of clarity they hadn't felt in years. They weren't just fasting from food. They were fasting from the noise, from the endless pull of the world around them. And in that space, they found something they didn't even know they were missing. "Do you see now?" the figure asked. "Fasting isn't about deprivation, it's about transformation." She nodded, the pieces beginning to fall into place. But then another question rose in her mind, one she couldn't ignore. "Why me? Why are you showing this to me?" The figure's expression didn't change, but there was a warmth in his voice as he replied, "Because you will tell them." She felt her chest tighten. The weight of that responsibility was immense, almost unbearable. She didn't feel worthy, didn't feel ready. "But I don't know how," she whispered. "I'm just one person." He looked at her with a kindness that seemed to go straight to her soul. "You are enough." Before she could respond, she felt a shift again, like the ground beneath her was moving. The light began to dim, not in a frightening way, but in a way that felt like the closing of a chapter. She realized what was happening, and her heart sank. She didn't want to leave. She wasn't ready. "Please," she said, her voice trembling, "don't send me back. I don't want to go." The figure stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Your time isn't over. There is more for you to do." She wanted to protest, to beg to stay in this place of peace and clarity. But before she could say another word, The light around her faded, and the vibrant world she had been in dissolved. She felt herself being pulled, like a thread being tugged backward, unraveling from the fabric of this extraordinary place. And then, with a jolt, she was back. She gasped for air, her chest heaving as her body came to life again. Her eyes fluttered open, and she was met with the stunned faces of her family and the frantic voices of the doctors. It was chaos, but she was alive. Her family rushed to her side, tears streaming down their faces. They hugged her, held her, kissed her hands and cheeks. The doctors called it a miracle. They had done everything they could, but by all accounts, she shouldn't have come back. They couldn't explain it. She couldn't either. Not yet. For a moment, she just lay there, her body weak, her mind racing. The sounds of the hospital filled her ears again. The beeping monitors, the hum of machines, the voices of nurses in the hallway. But something was different. She was different. It wasn't just that she had survived. It was what she had seen, what she had felt. She had been given a glimpse of something so much bigger than herself, something so much more profound than anything she had ever known. As the days went by and her strength returned, she couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. She replayed every moment in her mind, the light, the presence, the words that had been spoken to her. It was clear to her now, she had been sent back for a reason. She didn't know exactly how or where to begin, but one thing was certain. She couldn't keep this to herself. She had been given a second chance, not just to live, but to share the message she had been given. And even though the weight of that responsibility still felt overwhelming, she held on to the words she had heard before she returned. "You are enough." Those words would carry her through the days ahead as she began to piece together how to tell her story. A story that wasn't just about her, but about all of us. About life, about purpose, and about the incredible power of stepping away from the noise and finding what truly matters. Here's an expanded version of chapters 7 and 8, with an additional chapter added for depth. It builds more on her recovery, the ripple effect of her story, and its broader implications. When she returned to her body, she carried more than the memory of her experience. She carried a weight she couldn't ignore. It wasn't the kind of burden that drags a person down. It was the weight of a responsibility she hadn't asked for, but knew she couldn't refuse. Her body was still fragile, her muscles weak, and her movements slow, but inside, she felt alive with purpose. The doctors called her recovery miraculous. By all accounts, she shouldn't have survived. Her family celebrated, overjoyed that she was back, but for her, the return wasn't just survival, it was a rebirth. As she lay in the hospital bed during those early days, her mind was constantly replaying what had happened. The light, the presence, the figure who had spoken to her so clearly. The visions of people struggling and finding peace, of humanity's brokenness and its resilience. It was as if the world she had returned to wasn't quite real in comparison to the place she had been. She tried to focus on the ordinary, on eating, on sleeping, on responding to the doctor's questions. But her heart and mind were consumed by the extraordinary. At first, she was hesitant to share her experience. Who would believe her? Would people dismiss her, mock her, or say it was all in her head? But the more she thought about it, the more she felt an undeniable pull to speak. She hadn't been sent back for herself. She had been sent back for others. Her story wasn't hers alone. It was a message meant to ripple outward, touching lives far beyond her own. One day, as she sat with her family, she finally broke her silence. "I need to tell you something," she said. Her voice was soft, hesitant. They leaned in, sensing the gravity of her words. Slowly, carefully, she began to recount her experience. She told them about leaving her body, about the overwhelming peace she had felt, about the light and the figure who had spoken to her. She described the visions she had been shown, the struggles of humanity, the power of fasting to bring clarity and connection, and the mission she had been given to share this message. Her family listened in stunned silence. When she finished, her mother had tears in her eyes. "You were given a gift," her mother said softly. "Don't be afraid to share it." That encouragement was all she needed. She began telling her story to others, first to close friends, then to her church, and eventually to larger groups. Each time she told it, she found new layers of meaning in her experience. People listened with rapt attention, some moved to tears, others visibly deep in thought. It wasn't just her words that touched them, it was the way she spoke, with a sincerity and conviction that left no room for doubt. She spoke about fasting, not as a religious obligation or a way to deprive oneself, but as a tool for transformation. "Fasting isn't about what you give up," she would say. "It's about what you make room for. It's about stepping away from the noise of the world and creating space for the things that truly matter, for peace, for clarity, for connection with something greater than yourself." Her message resonated with people in ways she never could have anticipated. Some said her story inspired them to try fasting for the first time. Others said it gave them the courage to let go of the things that had been holding them back: old habits, toxic relationships, the endless distractions of modern life. Many said her story had reignited their faith, reminding them of the power of simplicity, stillness, and surrender. But it wasn't just her message that changed people, it was her presence. There was something about her now that was different. She carried herself with a quiet strength, a sense of peace that seemed to radiate outward. People would often tell her, "When I listen to you, I feel like I'm hearing something I've always known but had forgotten." She would smile at those words, knowing they weren't about her, they were about the message she had been given. As the months turned into years, her story continued to spread, reaching people she had never met, in places she had never been. Some heard it directly from her, others heard it through word of mouth, through recordings of her talks, or through articles written about her experience. Each time her story was told, it seemed to take on a life of its own, touching hearts and changing lives in ways she could never have imagined. But her journey wasn't without challenges. There were moments of doubt, times when she wondered if she was doing enough, if she was sharing her story in the right way. There were also moments of resistance, when people dismissed her experience or accused her of making it up, but she never let those moments deter her. She would remember the words the figure had spoken to her before sending her back. "You are enough." Those words became her anchor, her reminder that her job wasn't to convince everyone or to be perfect. It was simply to share her truth. One day, as she was speaking to a group, a woman in the audience raised her hand and asked, "Do you think what happened to you could happen to anyone?" She paused, considering the question. Then she said, "I think we all have moments when we're called to step away from the noise, to look beyond the surface of our lives and connect with something deeper. For me, it happened in a dramatic way, but for most people, it happens quietly, in a moment of stillness, in a prayer, in a decision to let go of something that no longer serves them. What I experienced isn't about me, it's about all of us. It's a reminder that we're never as far from peace and clarity as we think." As she spoke, she looked around the room and saw the faces of people who had been touched by her story, people who had found the courage to make changes in their lives, to seek healing, to reconnect with their faith. In that moment, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. Her journey had been unexpected and at times overwhelming, but it had brought her to a place of purpose and meaning she never could have imagined. To those hearing her story today, she would say this: life is noisy, chaotic, and full of distractions. It's easy to lose sight of what really matters, to feel disconnected or overwhelmed. But no matter where you are on your journey, there's always a way back. Whether it's through fasting, through prayer, through moments of quiet reflection, or through simply reaching out to someone who needs you, you have the power to create space for peace, clarity, and connection. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to have all the answers. You just have to take one step, however small, toward the things that truly matter. And in doing so, you'll find that the answers you've been searching for have been within you all along. Remember this: you are enough. Your story, your journey, your presence, it matters. And no matter what struggles you face or burdens you carry, there is always hope. There is always a way forward. You are never alone. Her story is a reminder of that hope. It's a reminder that even in our darkest moments, even when we feel lost or broken, we are capable of incredible transformation. And sometimes, all it takes is a little space, a little stillness, and the courage to listen to that quiet voice within.